You ain't black.
Hey, Large Kofi here, and a couple months ago, I made a YouTube short about Breon Ainsley and Chris Bumstead's little exchange at the 2021 Olympia, which I thought was one of the funniest moments that we've seen at an Olympia press conference, and really highlighted the rivalry between the two of them. And when I say rivalry, let me make it clear that it's a friendly rivalry. Now, the short went viral and it did very, very well, and as of right now, I think it's at around 7 million views or something like that. Now, the video got a ton of comments because based on the amount of views, it definitely hit a much broader demographic than I thought it would, but the number one comment that I kept seeing on that video was about Chris Bumstead turning black, and people also asking why that's okay. Now, being a bodybuilding fan, I never really looked at it that way. I mean, my first immediate instinct was, well, Chris Bumstead is obviously a white man. You can tell that he's white on stage, right? So I went back and looked at the short, and I scrutinized and analyzed the video a little more, and our boy Chris does look a little chocolatey, a little melanated, and maybe it's because I've been following the sport and I understand the purpose of the glaze, that to me it's not a big deal, but to somebody from the outside looking in who doesn't really know a lot about the sport and just sees black body as what a lot of people were calling it, or black face as what a lot of people were calling it, it made me wonder, is this an issue? Well, to me as a bodybuilding fan, obviously no, but in the last few years, I've noticed that bodybuilding is making a very slow renaissance. And to me, I've always had this idea that maybe in the next few years, it could actually slowly creep back into the mainstream, especially as we see guys like Bumstead and Terrence Ruffin and Urs Kalsinski and Martin Fitzwater and all these other young up-and-coming guys really building a name for themselves. Within the next 5 years, we can see more and more eyes on the sport. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but I hope, for the sake of the sport, that it does slowly creep back into the mainstream and we get more people interested. Now, of course, the only way to do that is to make the sport more appealing. And is this something that could potentially stop bodybuilding from creeping back into the mainstream? Yeah, probably. Now, to address the question of why white bodybuilders look a lot darker on stage, well, the darker your complexion, the more your muscles pop on stage, the more definition you get to see on stage, especially with the lighting. So when it comes to black bodybuilders, getting muscular definition to pop on stage, there's not too much help that we really need in that regard. Just some really good posing oil and you're good to go. My personal favorite is Hot Stuff, which I've been using for a couple years now. But we do have an advantage in that regard. So when I see black bodybuilders at either amateur or pro shows who are not glazed up, I'm like, what are you doing? Why? When it comes to our white counterparts, they need a little more help in that regard. You can't really be a white bodybuilder nowadays and not have any kind of tan, any kind of glaze on stage. You essentially need to get a little bit darker. Basically, you can't be pasty on stage because then you won't really be able to see any of your definition, especially underneath that lighting, and that's 100% gonna hurt you in the eyes of the judges. So yes, white bodybuilders do need to darken their complexion a little bit to help the muscular definition pop on stage. Now, is this fair? Yeah, it is actually. It's fair because bodybuilding is a competition, okay? It's bodybuilding. You want to present the best physique that you can on stage. Technically, glazing is not against the rules. It's a standard that's been practiced for a very long time. And black bodybuilders can glaze too. It's available to everybody. There's nothing that says we can't. It's something that is a part of the sport, and it's also something that if you're a white bodybuilder, you're basically required to do if you want any kind of competitive advantage. I personally have never seen a white bodybuilder on the amateur circuit who stepped on stage with no glaze and placed high. It just doesn't happen. So another question that might be coming into your head if you're not in the bodybuilding space is, why hasn't the IFBB addressed this issue? Well, for starters, the IFBB is not a politically correct organization. Look, bodybuilding is still a very, very niche sport. And because it's so niche, it doesn't need to appeal to a broader demographic. Everybody who's in the sport is in it because they want to be in it. That's why you don't really hear black bodybuilders complaining that their white counterparts get to wear glaze, because this is all a niche sport. We who are in the sport understand what it's about, but the people on the outside really don't. Obviously, when you expose some of this to a much broader demographic, kind of like my video did, you're going to get a lot more people who are going to ask questions like that. Some people who might even protest, actually. Well, the IFBB hasn't really brought this up, simply put, because they don't need to, and it would almost seem a little bit ridiculous for them to even entertain that. So there would be no reason for the IFBB to try to appeal to a very vocal minority in an already extremely niche sport. And the IFBB being non-PC due to the nicheness of the sport is probably why we haven't really seen a lot of conversation and discussions about trans athletes in bodybuilding. I'm sure there are plenty of trans people who are interested in bodybuilding that haven't gotten around to it because there aren't any rules around trans athletes, and the IFBB hasn't really gotten around to addressing that because socially the federation isn't there yet. And it goes back to what I'm saying about bodybuilding going back into the mainstream. That's also another issue that might come up within the next 5 years. As a bodybuilding fan, I never really looked at it as black body / black face, understanding the sport and understanding the purpose of that. And as bodybuilding continues to grow, and it will, and as it starts to creep its way back into the mainstream slowly, which it will with time, this is something that I 100% think is going to come up again. What are the implications of that? Only time will tell. We'll have to see. I don't necessarily think the practice of glazing should go away or is going to go away. It's a part of the sport, and I personally don't see it as being this competitive advantage for white bodybuilders, especially considering it's also available to black athletes. If you take glaze away from white athletes, it's not even going to be fair at that point. There is a purpose. It's not derogatory. It's not meant to be offensive. It's just a part of the sport, and it's essentially a means to an end. But that's just my 2 cents in my opinion as a fan. But I also want to know what you guys think. Get in the comment section. Let me know what you guys think about glazing and bodybuilding. Is it fair? Is it not fair? Do you agree with my points? Do you disagree? Let's have a discussion. And to make one final point before I get out of here, probably my most important point of the entire video, Chris Bumstead's the best black bodybuilder in the game. Thank you for watching.
You ain't black.